The war in Ukraine has entered a new complex phase, one where peace is no longer a distant fantasy, but rather a difficult and heavy conditional proposition. Ukraine's recent withdrawal from Sudzha in the Kursk region, paired with emerging reports of humanitarian treatment in contrast to Russia's failures in Mariupol, Bucha and Irpin, highlights the fundamental clash not only in military strategy but in the moral and political narratives that have shaped this conflict. Meanwhile, the world watches as Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin prepare for a crucial conversation this week, with the United States pressing for a ceasefire, an offer that Russia has agreed in principle, albeit with the usual Kremlin caveats. The departure of Ukrainian troops from Sudzha follows 7 months of bitter fighting. Residents who lived under Ukrainian control recount relatively humane treatment, I think. Troops who insisted that they were there to protect them from Russian tyranny, soldiers who shared supplies when possible, and an absence of the brutality that defined the Russian occupation of places like Mariupol and Bucha. And contrast this with Mariupol, a city that was turned into an apocalyptic wasteland after relentless Russian shelling, where residents were left without food, water or medical care, where mass graves bore testimony to Russia's indifference. Or consider Bucha and Irpin, where evidence of massacres and war crimes shocked the world. The occupation of Sudzha didn't mirror those horrors, reinforcing the idea that Ukraine doesn't fight like its enemy. This is not merely a war of territory, it's a battle over fundamental principles of governance, human rights, morality and the legitimacy of national sovereignty. And then there's Donald Trump, who appears determined to insert himself into this diplomatic arena. His envoy, Steve Witkoff, has already met with Putin, and discussions of a potential 30-day ceasefire are in motion, and Putin, always a seasoned strategist, has not outright dismissed the proposal, but insists that the original causes of the crisis must be addressed. Kremlin speak for Ukrainian concessions, territorial and otherwise. The Slovak Pravda newspaper warns that Putin's approach will be one of calculated delay, rejecting terms, demanding adjustments, setting conditions, and waiting for advantageous shifts on the battlefield before committing to anything concrete. With Russia now pressing Ukraine back in Kursk, Putin has little incentive to rush towards peace unless it secures his global objectives. And this is where Ukraine finds itself in a precarious position. As Dnevnik notes, Kyiv is reliant on American military and financial support, which remains uncertain under a Trump administration that has not been shy about questioning aid to Ukraine. And the acknowledgement that Ukraine cannot hold all occupied territories is a painful but pragmatic reality. But will it be enough to satisfy Putin? Highly unlikely. The Kremlin will push for more, sensing its advantage in both battlefield momentum and Western political fracturing. Meanwhile, Keir Starmer has been rallying European and NATO allies to prepare for a scenario where the war doesn't end swiftly. His coalition of the willing seeks to secure long-term support for Ukraine, ensuring that any ceasefire doesn't become a prelude to renewed aggression. Unlike Trump, Starmer sees a more measured but firm stance. He takes a more measured but firm stance, emphasising that peace cannot be achieved at the expense of Ukrainian sovereignty. If the ceasefire deal being discussed is merely a way for Russia to regroup and rearm, or to bully Ukraine into submission, the West will need to ensure Kyiv is not left vulnerable. It is no coincidence that European leaders are now discussing the expansion of military aid, even as diplomatic efforts accelerate. Putin's motivations are suspect. The French newspaper Le Figaro argues that for Russia, a ceasefire is more than just about ending hostilities, it's about reshaping global dynamics. A deal with Trump could provide Putin with a way to weaken NATO, fracture the West's united stance, and buy time for military and economic restructuring. As a former Ukrainian MP, Mustafa Nayyem, warns, Russia doesn't want a fair ceasefire, it wants Ukrainian capitulation. The coming days will reveal whether this is a serious effort towards peace or merely another chapter in a long drawn-out conflict. Ukraine, meanwhile, will have to navigate these talks carefully, balancing international pressure for compromise against the risk of conceding too much. While some, like Switzerland's Corriere del Ticino, are optimistic that this moment represents a turning point, others remain sceptical. Putin's history of leveraging negotiations as a cover for further military expansion is well documented, and Ukraine cannot afford to be naive. As Trump and Putin therefore prepare to speak, and as Starmer's coalition formulates its next steps, the world waits to see whether this fragile moment will lead to genuine de-escalation, or if, as many fear, it is simply a tactical pause before the next horrific offensive.